I'm a 45-year-old man, and I've been married to my wife, who's 35, for about 6 years. Honestly, I've never been happier. At first, I was a bit skeptical about our relationship because she had a kid from her previous marriage. But the moment I met her son, I was smitten. I never really wanted my own kids until I met my stepson. He was the sweetest little boy, and I knew then that I wanted to marry his mother. I told my wife that I didn't want to have children, but I would love her child like my own, and I've tried to keep that promise every day. She didn't want more kids either, so it worked out perfectly. Before we got married, my wife told me all about her ex-husband and his antics. He hadn't bothered us, so I didn't think he would be a problem. I knew we would have to share custody, but I didn't expect him to have any other role in our lives, so it was a bit of a bummer when he kept interfering. When we first started living together, my stepson was 11, but we'd known each other before that. After I married his mother, he asked if he could call me Dad since he called his biological father Papa. I was thrilled when he started calling me Dad, and naturally I said yes. We were a happy little family for a while until my wife's ex-husband began interfering. I think he felt insecure because my stepson was happier at home with me and his mom than with his biological father. Kids don't hold back. They say what's on their minds. Of course, our family had traditions and his favorite toys were with us. His biological father, a single man busy with work, didn't spend much time with him. It was understandable that he preferred staying with us. Neither my wife nor I implied that he should stay away from his father, but the fact that our home made him happier seemed to bother his dad. He started picking fights with me for no reason. Initially, I avoided confrontation, but his aggression grew over time. He even snapped at the kid a few times. That's when I decided I couldn't tolerate his behavior any longer. I stood up to him, telling him to back off and let us live our lives as we saw fit. He threatened custody a few times, which terrified my wife. I did my best to stay calm. I didn't want to be the reason she lost her son, and I certainly didn't want to lose him either. I cared for that kid as if he were my own, and it wasn't his fault that his biological father behaved like a jerk. We tried to maintain peace for the sake of the kid, but over the years, the hostility only grew. We stopped communicating and simply dropped off the kid at his father's place, and he did the same. What could have been a good co-parenting relationship was ruined because he couldn't accept that his son had another father figure. Another issue was that he stopped contributing financially to anything related to the kid, no school clothes or toys. While I was happy to provide, he neglected his responsibilities as a father. He became so accustomed to my wife and me covering everything that he completely stopped. My wife tried to discuss it with him, but he dismissed it, claiming he would pay for what mattered. We let it slide, avoiding conversations that inevitably turned into arguments. I grew tired of his constant presence in my life. Frankly, I couldn't care less that he wasn't contributing financially for his own kid. I had enough to provide for my family. It was somewhat sad to see how eager he was to involve himself in our lives. I understood his insecurity. His ex-wife had moved on happily while he remained bitter and single. Despite him being a terrible husband, I gave him the benefit of the doubt as a father. I didn't mind him spending time alone with the kid. Sometimes, though, he'd say inappropriate things in front of the kid, and I had to remind him to be careful. Aside from that, it was manageable. He didn't spend much time with his son, even when he had custody. Despite our animosity, we managed to co-parent as best as we could for my stepson's sake. As he grew older, he naturally spent less time with his biological father, but we never forced that choice on him. However, his father accused us of intentionally keeping the kid away from him, which was completely untrue. He was growing more independent, and we respected his choices. He decided to spend most of his time at our home, though he still visited his father occasionally. I encouraged him to spend time with his dad, but he preferred staying with us. He mentioned that his father was often absent at home, just watching TV alone. He hinted that his father didn't show much care, but didn't go into details. It seemed like he wasn't ready to discuss it, so I didn't push. My wife and I agreed to let him decide whether he wanted to see his father or not. His father didn't take it well, acting immaturely because he couldn't accept that our son was making his own choices. Teenagers deserve a say in their lives, and I trusted him to decide what was best for him. Over the years, he grew more distant from his father, with fewer visits. He still felt obligated to visit occasionally, maybe out of guilt, showing up every couple of months. His father eventually stopped pestering us. He didn't really care about the kid, just about matching the time spent with us in some twisted competition. When my stepson entered high school, college talk started buzzing around. His school was prepping him, so we discussed his plans and aspirations. He didn't want his father to feel excluded, so he went over to talk college with him, too. When he returned, he seemed a bit subdued, but assured me he was okay when I asked. A week or two later, his father called. I usually ignored his calls, but since my stepson was with him, I picked up, thinking it was about him. Instead, his father went straight to the point. My stepson's college tuition. He mentioned my stepson had been discussing it for weeks, as if I didn't already know. I asked what he wanted, and he bluntly stated he wouldn't pay a dime, insisting I should start saving up. His attitude infuriated me. I countered that we would split the tuition, half from him, half from my wife and me. He outright refused to contribute, claiming I had stolen his son by marrying his ex-wife, making it my duty to pay for college. His excuses were absurd, and I couldn't help but laugh. His response, the usual threats, had reclaimed custody if I caused trouble. He was pushing my buttons. I knew he was a joke of a person, but using his son as leverage against me and my wife was despicable. I reminded him it was equally his responsibility to support his son's education. Threatening custody wouldn't work this time. I wouldn't back down either. He had to do the right thing or leave our lives for good. That was the deal I was prepared to stick to. After what felt like hours of arguing, I gave up trying to reason with him. I told him if he wanted to play this game, we'd settle it in court. He needed to lawyer up and save money. I hung up and tried to move on with my day. It wasn't until my stepson came home that I realized he was upset with me. I tried talking to him, urging him to share what was bothering him. He became angry, accusing me of not loving him enough to pay for his college, suggesting that was why I was arguing with his father. His words hit me hard. I felt terrible. I reassured him of my love and explained I was trying to protect his future, but teenagers aren't always receptive to reason. He brushed me off, giving me the cold shoulder whenever I tried to talk. I felt like I had let him down by prioritizing my fight with his father over his feelings. I should have checked my ego and focused more on him. Was I wrong to threaten his father with a custody battle if he didn't pay for college? Update. In the days that followed, my stepson remained adamant about ignoring me. I understood his anger, but needed him to know I wasn't fighting with his father out of anything but love for him. He's my kid, regardless of genetics. I only wanted what was best for him and ensured his father treated him as well as my wife and I do. He deserves love and support from all the adults in his life. His reaction to my conflict with his father troubled me deeply. I didn't want him to withdraw. We used to have an open relationship where he shared everything, and I cherished that. Now he was being secretive. I understood teenagers need more privacy, but his sudden silence worried me. He wasn't talking much to his mom either, and we both fretted over him. I gently prodded him to open up about what was bothering him, but he remained guarded. I didn't want to pressure him into talking if it made him uncomfortable. He made small talk with me and his mom occasionally, but avoided discussing the issues weighing on him, like the college fund or his father. Ever since the day he got angry and yelled at me, those topics were off limits. I desperately wanted him to confide in me and share his feelings. Whatever my next move was, it had to consider his emotions. I was willing to set aside differences for his sake, even pay for his college entirely if it would ease his mind. I just wanted his father to step up. I never would have asked him to contribute if I didn't think it was right. Update. My wife received court papers from his lawyer regarding custody of my stepson. I had assumed he was bluffing. He'd threatened custody since I married his ex. I always urged him not to drag custody into our disputes. Initially, my wife feared he'd take her son away, so I tried to keep things cordial and appease him whenever possible. Whenever he was upset with me or my wife, he'd threaten custody, but it was always empty until now. When he insisted he'd contest custody over my stepson's college tuition, I assumed it was another bluff. The court papers proved me wrong. If he thought I'd let him win, he was delusional. I'd fight tooth and nail to protect my kid. He had nothing on his side. My wife and I were excellent parents, whereas he was barely adequate. He hadn't contributed financially since I married into the family. I'd been supporting my stepson all along, so I wasn't worried. My wife, however, was concerned. I assured her I wouldn't let anything happen to her or our son. My stepson, already angry with me, grew even more furious. He blamed me for pushing his father, saying none of this would have happened if I hadn't argued with him about college tuition. I understood his frustration, but his anger was getting to me. He wouldn't talk normally. He just threw blame around, upsetting his mother even more with his evasiveness. I understood the need to give him space, but I couldn't accept everything being dumped on me. I loved him, but at 16 he couldn't act like a petulant child. I taught him to communicate and solve problems, not make them worse by being difficult. I told him blaming me wasn't helping and assured him I'd talk to his father to drop the case. He got furious, insisting I fight for custody instead of dropping it. His erratic behavior worried me. Update 3. I'm worried about my son. He refused to discuss the issue, typical moody teenager. I pressed him for an explanation in the following days, but he evaded me. I was stunned when he finally revealed he hated visiting his father. I knew they had issues, but I didn't realize how deep they ran. He'd rarely visited since becoming a teen, and I never realized he felt obligated to go and hated it. After days of asking, he finally opened up. He said he wanted me to fight for him. It saddened me that he thought I wouldn't stand up for him. I assured him I'd do anything for him if he confided in me. He explained that he disliked going to his father's because he felt pressured. His father would blame his mother if he didn't visit. He hated the atmosphere there, especially when his father said mean things about me and his mother. Curious, I asked what was said, but he refused to repeat them, hinting they were hurtful. I didn't want those words lingering in his mind, so I stayed quiet, urging him to continue. He revealed more, how unwelcome he felt at his father's place and that he didn't enjoy spending time there. He confessed he only went for our sake. All this time, I thought he resented me for my disputes with his father, but he was actually angry at his father and wanted me to end his visits altogether. I felt defeated. I never wanted him to feel pressured to make us happy. If only he had told me sooner, I would have protected him from visiting his father's house ever again. I assured him he had nothing to worry about. If he didn't want to go, he didn't have to. He seemed relieved, but I could tell he was still holding something back. I pushed him to tell me everything. Reluctantly, he confessed something that infuriated me beyond measure. He told us his father had been taking his pocket money whenever he visited. We had been giving him a few bucks weekly since he was 12, and now I learned his father was stealing it. What kind of father does that to his own kid? I was seething with anger. I wanted to confront his father immediately and take action. If it were up to me, he would lose custody, and my stepson would never have to see him again. Update 4. It's been a few days since my last update. When I finally got my stepson to open up about what was bothering him, he reluctantly revealed that his father had been taking his pocket money during visits. My wife and I had been giving him a few bucks every week since he was 12, and it infuriated me to find out his father had been taking it from him. What kind of father does that to his own kid? It wasn't even a significant amount of money. He was just a despicable human being. I was furious now, determined to make him pay. If it were up to me, he would lose custody, and my stepson would never have to see his face again. He had been forcing visits against my stepson's will, and I wouldn't tolerate it. I promised my wife I'd protect her and her son, and that's exactly what I intended to do. I always thought he was just a jerk, but now I saw he was far worse. He dragged his own child into our petty disputes, making him visit when he didn't want to, and even taking his money. It was clear he didn't care about his son at all. His threats of custody were just to spite us, not out of love for his child. Update 5. We hired top lawyers for the custody hearing, and after a few days, they sent our papers to him. His lawyers reached out to settle outside of court, which I expected, knowing he only cared about money. I refused to settle. I wanted justice in court. His lawyer tried multiple times to convince us to settle beforehand, but I stood firm. I knew exactly what he was after, and I wasn't going to give in. He had no valid arguments for court. My wife and I were clearly better parents than him. When we insisted on going to court, he grew desperate. Eventually, he called to admit he couldn't afford to take us to court. I was resolute in my decision to proceed to court regardless. After weeks of back and forth, he finally saw reason and called to suggest we drop the case and return to how things were. I made it clear we weren't going back anywhere. I bluntly told him that my wife and I wanted custody and wanted him out of our lives for good. He agreed without hesitation, even callously mentioning the expense of raising the child and implying I should take him off his hands. I was appalled by his words. His lawyers contacted mine to finalize everything. We ensured a clause stating he would pay half of the college tuition, which he initially refused. I made it clear we could settle this in court instead, and he found himself cornered. It wasn't about the money. It was about holding him accountable for making my stepson's life miserable without even discussing it with us. Eventually, he agreed to the terms, knowing it was the best he could hope for. The best outcome was his absence from our lives and the sheer happiness on my stepson's face when he learned he wouldn't have to cater